In the 1880s, the American West had a simple rule: survival was a luxury. While the history books talk about pioneers and progress, the police ledgers tell a different story. A story of towns where the murder rate was 100 times higher than modern-day New York. These weren't just places to live. They were sentences of death. The reality is that for every hero, there were 1,000 victims. And for every lawman, there was a town that was technically a cemetery in waiting. Today, we open the American vault to rank the 5 deadliest capitals of the frontier. We are analyzing them through the lens of forensic history and survival statistics. We will look at the dirt, the lead, and the absolute absence of mercy. You wouldn't have survived 24 hours in our number 1. This is the geography of death. Step inside and try to keep your boots on. Number 5, Abilene, Kansas. The stench of chaos. Abilene was nothing but a cluster of log huts until Joseph McCoy arrived in 1867. He saw a golden opportunity where the railroad met the Chisholm Trail. But where there is cattle and cash, there is a specialized breed of violence. By 1870, Abilene had become the Sodom of the plains. Every summer, over 5,000 cowboys arrived, having spent 3 months in the desert with nothing but cattle and dust. They were young, they were armed, and they were fueled by a toxic mix of isolation and rot-gut whiskey. The town was divided into 2 worlds, the Texas section and the God-fearing side. The line between them was stained with blood almost every night. The local jails were made of stone, but they couldn't hold the sheer volume of rage. The most brutal moment in Abilene's history didn't happen during a bank robbery. It happened when the town tried to hire a legend to stop the bleeding. On October 5, 1871, Marshal Wild Bill Hickok stood in the center of a powder keg. A gambler named Phil Coe had been firing his gun in the street. When Hickok confronted him, the air in Abilene became heavy with the scent of ozone and death. Coe fired, the bullet grazing Hickok's coat. Hickok fired back, hitting Coe twice in the stomach. But the tragedy was just beginning. In the chaotic darkness of the street, Hickok saw another man charging toward him with a drawn weapon. The marshal didn't hesitate. He fired 2 rounds into the man's chest. When the smoke cleared, Hickok leaned over the body to identify his victim. His face turned as pale as the dead man's. It wasn't an outlaw. It was Mike Williams. Williams was Hickok's own deputy and his closest friend in that godless town. The trauma of that night broke Hickok. He never fought another gunfight in Abilene, but the statistics remain. During its peak, Abilene saw a murder rate of 100 per 100,000 people. In a town that size, it meant you were 20 times more likely to die by a bullet than in modern-day Chicago. It was a town where the only thing cheaper than a life was the whiskey that ended it. Number 4, Deadwood, South Dakota, the Trespasser's Tomb. Deadwood was a city built on a foundation of theft and desperation. Located in the Black Hills, it was technically inside the Great Sioux Reservation. This meant that every man, woman, and child in Deadwood was a criminal under federal law. Because the government refused to recognize the town, there was no law. There were no courts. There were no police. There was only the Badlands District, a hellscape of mud, opium, dens, and rot. Deadwood was a magnet for the dregs of the continent. Men who had failed everywhere else came here to find gold, or to take it from someone else's cold hands. The violence in Deadwood was rarely about honor. It was forensic, it was clinical. It was about the gold dust in a dead man's pocket. While Hollywood obsesses over the death of Wild Bill Hickok, the vault looks at the daily dead. In 1877 alone, the rate of unexplained disappearances in the Badlands was astronomical. Miners were found in the mud every morning with their throats cut or their skulls crushed by a dead blow hammer. These weren't duels. These were executions for profit. The city was so violent that in its first 2 years, it didn't even have a formal graveyard. Bodies were simply buried where they fell or dumped in the gulch. The murder rate hit 130 per 100,000. That's higher than almost any city in the recorded history of the Americas. In Deadwood, you didn't look for the law. You looked for the biggest gun, and you never ever turned your back on a stranger. But even the gold fever of Deadwood was nothing compared to the ice-cold paranoia of our next stop. Number 3, Bodie, California. The altar of ice and rage. Bodie sat at 8,300 feet in the Sierra Nevada mountains. It was a place of extreme isolation, where the wind never stopped howling. The climate was so brutal that it created a psychological phenomenon known as body fever. It was a mix of oxygen deprivation, social isolation, and extreme mineral wealth. By 1880, Bodie was home to 10,000 people, and almost every one of them was armed to the teeth. The town was so infamous for its violence that a young girl's diary from the time became a legend. Her last entry before moving there read, "Goodbye, God, I'm going to Bodie." In this town, men didn't kill for gold as much as they kill for ego. It was the home of the bad man from Bodie, a title that men died to claim. In 1881, the violence became so pervasive that the town's leading citizens formed a secret society. They called it the 601. This was a vigilante group that didn't believe in the slow wheels of justice. On a freezing night in January, they dragged a man named Joseph DeRoche from his cell. DeRoche had murdered a man in a bar for no reason other than a perceived disrespectful look. The 601 didn't give him a trial. They took him to a makeshift gallows and let the wind do the rest. But the vigilantes were just as violent as the criminals they hunted. The cycle of revenge in Bodie was a closed loop of blood. The local newspapers of 1881 recorded a murder rate of 116 per 100,000. In Bodie, you were more likely to die from a bullet than from the freezing cold. And the cold killed people every single week. It was a town that God forgot, but the devil called home. Number 2, Tascosa, Texas, the Sodom of the Panhandle. Tascosa was the ultimate sanctuary for the damned. It was located at the junction of the cattle trails and the outlaw trails of New Mexico. If a man was wanted in 5 states, Tascosa was the only place he could sleep with both eyes closed. But the price of that sanctuary was a level of violence that shocked even the Texas Rangers. Tascosa was a town without a moral compass. The saloons were open 24 hours a day, and the sound of gunfire was the local soundtrack. The event that defines the horror of Tascosa is the big fight at the junction in March 1886. It didn't start with a bank robbery. It started with a whisper in a woman. 2 rival groups, the LS Ranch Cowboys and the local Home Rangers, clashed in the dead of night. The streets of Tascosa became a slaughterhouse. Men were firing from behind barrels, through windows, and from the mud of the street. When the sun rose, the town was silent. 4 men lay dead in the street, and dozens more were bleeding out in the dark. The burials happened that same afternoon at Boot Hill. This cemetery wasn't for the elderly or the sick. Every single man buried there had died with his boots on, the frontier slang for being murdered. The forensic statistics of Tascosa are a nightmare. The homicide rate was estimated at over 150 per 100,000. In Tascosa, life wasn't just cheap, it was a joke. A man could be killed for his horse, his hat, or simply for being in the way of a bullet. But even the Sodom of the Panhandle looks like a quiet village compared to our number one. We are now entering the heart of the storm. Number 1. El Paso, Texas, the six-shooter capital of the world. Welcome to the darkest file in the American vault. In 1881, El Paso, Texas, was the most dangerous place on the surface of the earth. It wasn't just a town, it was a geographic vortex of death. Sitting on the border between the United States and Mexico, it was a lawless transition zone. It was the headquarters for every smuggler, cattle thief, and hired assassin in the Southwest. But what made El Paso number 1 wasn't just the crime, it was the scale of the violence. This wasn't a town of individual duels. This was a town of urban warfare. Large gangs of cowboys, which at the time was a synonym for outlaws, would seize the streets. They would fire thousands of rounds into the air and into buildings just to watch the residents crawl. The law in El Paso was a death sentence for whoever wore the badge. Most marshals lasted less than a month. Some lasted only hours. The event that solidified El Paso's reputation happened on April 14, 1881. It is known as the 4 dead in 5 seconds gunfight. Marshal Dallas Stoudenmeier, a giant of a man with a hair-trigger temper, walked into a dispute. In 5 seconds, the street was littered with bodies. Stoudenmeier pulled his twin Colts and fired with such speed that witnesses couldn't count the shots. He killed a man named John Hale, then turned and shot a bystander by accident. Then he gunned down 2 more men who were trying to flee. 4 lives ended in the time it takes to draw a single breath. But the violence in El Paso was constant. It was a city of ambush culture. Men were shot through windows while eating dinner. They were stabbed in their beds. They were hung from telegraph poles by mobs that numbered in the hundreds. The American Vault's forensic data is truly terrifying. In the early 1880s, El Paso's murder rate exceeded 300 per 100,000. To give you context, that is 3 times higher than the most dangerous modern war zones. If you walked down the main street of El Paso in 1881, you were statistically entering a kill zone. There was no mercy here, no romantic sunset. There was only the iron, the mud, and the certainty that your life was worth exactly the price of the lead that would eventually find you. It was the capital of death, the end of the road, the ultimate proof that in the Old West, survival was the only true miracle. We look back at these 5 towns and we see legends in movies. But the vault sees the ledgers of the dead. We see the widows who never got answers and the bodies that the desert eventually turned to dust. Life was cheap because the frontier was a machine that chewed through human souls. These towns were the gears of that machine. They were places where the darkness of the human heart was allowed to roam free. Hollywood gave you the myth. The American Vault gives you the reality. And the reality is that the West was won by those who were lucky enough not to die in the mud of El Paso. The file on the deadliest towns is now closed, but the vault is deep. The shadows of the past are long, and we are just beginning to shine a light on them.
Subscribe to the American Vault. Turn on the notifications Because in a world of shadows, the only thing more dangerous than the truth is not knowing it at all. See you in the next file.